The petrodollar agreement that Saudi Arabia made with the United States 50 years ago has ended with no new agreement in place. Now, Saudi Arabia will sell oil in multiple currencies, including the Chinese yuan, the European euro, and the Japanese yen, instead of exclusively in US dollars, a major blow to the dominance of the US dollar. Saudi Arabia refused to renew the 50-year-old petrodollar agreement with the United States. Do you recall hearing this? This is just a sample of many news stories we saw on various financial and economic platforms last June, which dominated the economic scene. They all talked about the end of the secret agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which lasted 50 years and was related to pricing oil in dollars, or as it was headlined, the death of the petrodollar. So much so that if we check the number of searches for the word petrodollar on Google worldwide, we'll find that it has reached its peak last month, which was June. In the past 20 years, which is the maximum period for monitoring, we saw that these countries had the highest search interest in the term. What is this strange story? What is the petrodollar? Was there really a secret 50-year-old agreement between Saudi Arabia and the US to price oil in dollars, and has that agreement now ended? Is this truly the beginning of the end for the dollar? Let's start our episode and understand the story of this secret petrodollar agreement. On November 15, 1974, a very strange story occurred in the city of Tacoma in the far northwest of the United States on the Pacific Ocean. The cattle ranchers in the city entered into a partnership with RGB Sales, headed by Richard Burgess, who held a patent for converting cow manure into odorless liquid, and Worldwide Marine, a company that transported goods in containers managed by Michael Randazzo. Under this partnership, shipments of 50,000 metric tons of liquid cow manure would be provided monthly for 3 years and shipped to Bahrain and Dubai. The liquid waste would be mixed with sawdust and used as fertilizer for desert reclamation projects. In return, Bahrain and Dubai would pay $1.2 billion, meaning the two companies and the cattle ranchers would make millions while the dairy sector was struggling and losing money. This sounds great, but there is a question. On what basis did these two companies make a deal that would earn them millions of dollars? A few months earlier, Randazzo and Burgess, the owners of the two companies, claimed they had made this deal with Bahraini Prince Mohammed Khalil Ibrahim, who would also pay $10 million in advance to help cover initial costs. Consequently, they signed a contract with the Bahraini prince, and the Northwestern National Bank in Port Angeles funded part of the project's costs with a $400,000 loan, which at that time represented half the bank's lending capacity. They took part of this money, and the cattle ranchers began purchasing storage tanks for the project, which were very expensive. Later, Michael Randazzo, the owner of the container transport company, told them he never received a check from Bahrain for $16 million, but when he deposited the check, it was returned unpaid because the account had no funds. Bahraini police later discovered that the person who claimed to be a Bahraini prince was actually an employee at an airline company and arrested him. Authorities in Bahrain and Dubai said they knew nothing about the fertilizer project, and the bank that provided the loan was on the brink of bankruptcy. The FBI and Interpol intervened to investigate this bizarre fraud. This story is one of many that happened during that period, reflecting the urgent desire both of governments and companies in the United States and Europe to absorb and benefit from the petrodollars that they believed had suddenly fallen upon oil-exporting countries in the Middle East after the significant increase in oil prices during that period. As the largest oil exporters, the Arab countries, led by Saudi Arabia, gradually reduced their oil production by 25% to pressure the United States and Western countries to achieve political and economic demands after the October 1973 war. This resulted in a significant increase in oil prices. The price of a barrel of Saudi crude oil from Ras Tanura was $2.50 in January 1973, which jumped to more than $5 per barrel by mid-October of the same year. 2.5 months later, prices had nearly doubled, reaching about $12 per barrel in January 1974. This oil shock caused the U.S. administration and Western governments to panic. The ugly face of these governments' people emerged as they began expressing their indignation with arrogance and insolence. They said, for example, Why should we pay more money because of oil we discovered, and started demanding their governments take firm stances to stop what they called blackmail? For example, one of the letters sent to the editor of the New York Times in December 1973 expressed shock at the current folly of allowing 10 million Arabs to threaten the economic security of the civilized world. The issue went beyond mere racist venting when a series of articles began appearing during this period calling for the U.S. military to ensure a smooth flow of oil without such price increases. It was later revealed that these articles were prompted by official entities, such as an article published in Harper's Magazine in March 1975 under the pseudonym Miles Ignotus, a Latin phrase meaning unknown soldier. It was later revealed that the author was Edward Lutwook, a neoconservative at Johns Hopkins University who wrote several articles in this vein. The article outlined how to break the Arabs' oil power, arguing that high oil prices justified a U.S. military response. It proposed that if the Arabs imposed another oil embargo, U.S. Marines should storm Saudi Arabia's eastern shores, and the 82nd Airborne Division should parachute in to secure Saudi oil fields and force a resumption of production. The shock that Americans and other Western countries experienced was not just due to the sudden rise in oil prices and the consequent increase in oil import costs. It was also due to the impact on the U.S. economy, which took a severe hit, leading to rising inflation and unemployment, and worsening of the balance of payments deficit, especially since the country was just recovering from the blow of the Vietnam War, which cost 25,000 lives and $100 billion. In my opinion, the real shock stemmed from the end of the economic exploitation that had lasted from after World War II in 1948 until 1973. A quarter-century of the United States and its oil companies exploiting Arab countries was finally coming to an end before their eyes. A quarter-century of buying oil at very low prices to fuel the economic advancement and expansion of the United States was over. The oil wealth that the Arabs accumulated after the 1973 war was not only deserved, but it was also an attempt to compensate for even a small part of what the Americans had plundered over 25 years. For those who do not know, the price of a barrel of oil extracted from the Middle East remained below $2 per barrel from 1948 to 1971. For about a quarter century, the price did not rise above $2. The surprising and astonishing thing is that if the price of oil had risen gradually according to the compound inflation rate in European countries, for example, from 1947, like other goods that naturally increased in price each year, the price of a barrel of crude oil would have reached $10.20 by 1973. So why did the price of a barrel of oil from the Middle East remain so low for such a long period? Simply because the pricing of oil was not determined by supply and demand forces, but was managed, controlled, and manipulated by global oil companies, particularly the 7 major companies known as the Seven Sisters. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil, both of which merged in 1999 to become ExxonMobil, Standard Oil of California, which became Chevron, Gulf Oil, Texaco, Anglo-Persian Oil, which became BP, and Royal Dutch Shell. What exactly was happening? Let's focus, because this is very important. These companies owned most of the world's oil through oil concessions, so they exploited this monopoly to maximize their profits by keeping the oil price low. How do you maximize profits while keeping the oil price low? The idea is that they usually pay the countries from which they had concessions a percentage of the posted oil price. So they paid lower royalties to these countries, mainly the Middle Eastern countries. Then they took this very cheap oil and refined it into final petroleum products at much higher prices. Thus, they created a wide gap between the crude oil, for which they paid royalties based on a percentage of the low price, and the products they derived from this oil. Middle Eastern oil was very cheap compared to any crude extracted from other parts of the world, like the Gulf of Mexico, for instance. The exploitation of the Middle Eastern oil served the economic interest of oil-importing countries at the expense of oil-exporting countries. The injustice and anger felt by oil-exporting countries led some of them, such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, and Venezuela, to form the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, in September 1960, aiming to create a strong front capable of negotiating collectively and reclaiming their rights from global oil cartels and Western governments. As a result of the doubling of oil prices after the Arab countries united and cut off oil supplies to the United States and the countries supporting the occupying entity in 1973, accumulated reserves from selling this oil, known as petrodollars, increased. Their volume rose from about $13 billion in 1973 to about $50 billion in 1974. This means that within just 1 year, oil revenues nearly quadrupled. This is when the term petrodollar first appeared, which hadn't been used before. What's the story behind this term? Who coined it? What exactly does it mean? The first person to coin the term petrodollar was Professor Ibrahim Ois, of Egyptian origin and a professor of economics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., in a research paper in 1974. In the introduction to the research paper published by Georgetown University, Professor Ois said that to focus on studying the oil revenues that arose due to the sharp rise in oil prices from the beginning of 1974, he proposes a new term, petrodollar, which he defines as U.S. dollars earned from the sale of oil. Therefore, we can say that petrodollars are simply the proceeds from selling oil in U.S. dollars. So, if Saudi Arabia, for example, decides to sell part of its oil to China in Chinese yuan, the yuan it receives from China can be called petro-yuan. This means that as long as oil exporting countries sell oil in dollars, there will be dollar revenues, hence petrodollars. Therefore, to say that the petrodollar system is dead, oil exporting countries would have to sell oil in a currency other than the dollar. Has this happened? No, and it won't happen anytime soon. Do you know what proportion of global oil trade was priced in dollars last year, 2023? 80% of global oil transactions were priced in dollars. Therefore, talk about the death of the petrodollar is highly inaccurate. Let's focus on this. As we said, after oil prices doubled from late 1973, the volume of petrodollars increased among oil exporting countries. They had to find ways to utilize these large dollar surpluses. This led to the emergence of another term related to the petrodollar recycling, which means reinvesting oil money or petrodollars in other channels that benefit oil exporting countries. At the same time, the United States began actively seeking to channel the surplus oil wealth in ways that benefited the American economy. Most American officials were convinced that the more Middle Eastern oil-rich countries invested in the United States, the more they would be committed to the success of the American economy because their money was invested in it. For this reason, a research report published by the U.S. Treasury in January 1974 predicted that OPEC members would be significantly less likely to disrupt economies in which they owned assets. Increasing their wealth in these economies would reduce the likelihood of them pursuing policies aimed at hindering other economies, such as cutting off oil supplies as they did previously. The U.S. Treasury believed that financial interdependence between the United States and oil-producing countries would lead them to end the oil embargo and refrain from future attacks on the American economy, and they might also lower oil prices. This was the main goal for the Americans. Therefore, the Treasury began to act, along with other U.S. agencies and departments, such as the State Department, Commerce, Defense, and the National Security Council, to strongly encourage Arab countries to invest in American companies and deposit their money in American banks. This led to Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger discussing with Saudi officials in December 1973 the creation of a new mechanism for cooperative arrangements such as technology transfer. Being the world's largest economy, with a large, diverse, and open market and possessing the world's strongest currency, the dollar, along with the Arab oil-rich countries' need for American companies to implement their development projects and their need to arm themselves with advanced American weapons and acquire technology, the oil-rich countries began recycling petrodollars into the American economy. By mid-1978, the United States had become the largest single destination for Arab capital. We're talking about Arab investments that reached $29 billion in the U.S. at that time, most of it in the form of bank deposits and purchases of U.S. Treasury bonds, with a few billion invested in tangible assets like real estate, livestock farming, and food manufacturing companies. Arab investors even tried to acquire a controlling stake in the giant aircraft manufacturer Lockheed Martin, the largest U.S. defense contractor, but they couldn't because the company's executives rejected the acquisition offer. Recycling petrodollars into the American economy helped the United States reduce the huge current account deficit it was suffering from at that time, finance the U.S. government's budget, and of course it had a significant impact on supporting the strength of the dollar, contrary to what some American economists try to downplay in their writings about the influence of the petrodollar on the strength of the U.S. currency in a misleading manner. Just the fact that oil exporting countries settle their oil exports in dollars creates demands for the dollar because countries have to hold it to buy oil. This helps maintain its value and status as the world's primary reserve currency. The impact of recycling petrodollars didn't stop there. It also lowered the cost of borrowing for the United States because of the influx of billions of dollars from oil exporting countries into U.S. Treasury bonds kept American interest rates lower. This, of course, positively affected the American consumer's borrowing ability, thereby increasing consumption, which ultimately supports economic growth. From the 1970s until now, petrodollar funds have increased with a gradual rise in oil prices over decades. However, the rate of petrodollar recycling or reinvestment of oil money in the American economy has decreased, especially due to the growth of the economies of oil-exporting Arab countries, expansion of their economic structures, and their ability to absorb oil revenues. Thus, a large part of the petrodollar is no longer recycled into the American economy, but is instead injected directly into the local economy and managed through sovereign wealth funds. We can easily observe, for example, the decline in holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds by wealthy Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia. According to the latest data from the U.S. Treasury, Saudi Arabia's holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds in April last year, 2024, were $135.4 billion, ranking 17th among the largest foreign holders of U.S. Treasury bonds. This is after the Arab oil exporting countries were among the largest investors in Treasury bonds in the 1970s. The local economies of oil-rich Arab countries have become capable of absorbing a large part of the accumulated oil reserves due to their strategic goal of diversifying their economies away from oil. This requires injecting billions of dollars into infrastructure and reshaping the economic structure. A prime example of this is Saudi Arabia, which is currently investing enormous amounts in projects aiming at reforming and diversifying its economy. If we talk about just one sector, the construction sector, for example, according to a research report published by the real estate consultancy group Knight Frank based in London, Saudi Arabia will become the largest construction market in the world. We're talking about a total value of construction projects reaching $181.5 billion by the end of 2028. Last year alone, 2023, more than $140 billion in construction contracts were awarded, most of them in the capital, Riyadh. So we are talking about an economy capable of absorbing these billions of dollars. In your opinion, could we see a sharp decline in the strength of the US dollar in the world soon? Or will it remain the dominant currency for many years? And why?